to pick up where we left off. We've been talking about physical development during middle adulthood. Today we want to finish up physical development as well as look at kind of an overview about some issues around cognitive development. Many middle-aged adults experience increase in body fat and decrease in lean body mass. In other words, made up of muscle and bone. Sometimes a term that's often used to describe this kind of experience is the middle-age spread in terms of, again, redistribution of weight. I think one of the most important things that, again, we begin to talk about when we're talking about young adulthood, weight gain, muscle loss is not inevitable. A lot of it has to do with, again, lifestyle issues that we've already mentioned and the extent to which middle-aged adults continue to remain physically active. And so these shifts and changes do not necessarily have to be characteristic, though they tend to be patterns that exist simply because middle-aged adults are less likely to be as physically active as they have been in the past. And so again, as we've already talked about, with the change in basal metabolism, is that shifts and changes. If there's a reduction in activity level, then particularly the kind of activity that would involve in continuing to do not only aerobic type exercise but also resistance or things that continue to keep muscles strong, many middle-aged adults will see some shifts and changes in their weight. And the distribution of that weight tends to shift as well. Again, a lot of this simply has to do with the level of exercise and activity that adults continue to engage in. Strength and coordination decline gradually, and again, remember that much of the changes that are taking place during middle adulthood are not dramatic changes. They are gradual changes. Again, over this period of time, though, I think more and more middle-aged adults do become aware of some of those shifts and changes. So again, strength and coordination does show some gradual decline. Leg muscles begin to weaken first, and we do tend to see that endurance often holds up better than strength. And again, depending upon the level of activity that's involved. I remember a couple of years ago, I was involved in building, which hopefully I'll never do again, building a retaining wall. And I believe that there were several hundred blocks. These are somewhere around 75-pound blocks that we were using. And I don't know that I was ever so sore for so long in my life after having lifted those blocks for hour after hour over the course of several days. And what I got really in touch with, which unfortunately was the reality, that was not a normal part of my life in terms of lifting weight, particularly something that would be considered fairly heavy. And I started off pretty strong, didn't seem to be any problem, and then as time went along, they got heavier and heavier and heavier. And like I said, afterwards I was in a great deal of pain simply from exerting something that I normally don't do. And I got real in touch with particularly in terms of resistance, and particularly in terms of lifting weight, that very little of what I do day in and day out involves that. I get a good bit of the aerobic exercise because I do walk a lot, I'm moving a lot, but I don't do a lot that requires lifting of anything substantial. And so I think that happens for a lot of middle-aged adults, so that when there is that physical exertion, particularly those things that would require lifting weights, it tends to be random now and then we tend to pay the price. And we become very much aware of it. And like I said, the other thing I got real in touch with is how long it took me to recover from that experience before I felt like I was back to normal again. In fact, I was beginning to wonder if I ever would return back to normal. And I did that, and only to find out when we built our house not too long ago, they had to tear down a third of the wall, of which I had to put it back again at the end of construction. And like I said, I have no intentions after having built a third of that wall again that I ever want to build a retaining wall. Or if I do, I'm using those little bitty blocks and not the big ones. But it was a real statement to me that I really needed to be conscious of that, and I really needed to be involved in not only the aerobic exercise, but I really needed to do something about continuing to do some resistance, some lifting of weights. And so I did. A number of years ago, I did buy the weights. Unfortunately, I hate to admit that the weights still sit in the room and they don't get lifted very often. though it clearly is a goal, and hopefully I'll start that back up again. So strength, coordination decline, leg muscles begin to weaken first. That may seem a little bit of a surprise. People would probably tend to think that arm muscles and some of those would decline faster because at least we're mobily moving, walking, climbing stairs, those kinds of things. And clearly what I do find is my endurance does tend to hold up better than my strength does. We see a beginning, and really the effect of this probably doesn't become known until later adulthood, but there is the beginning of osteoporosis, and that is the thinning of bones. And what we find is, and it tends to affect women more so than men, and it does increase the risk of fractures, but that tends to be more characteristic of the later adult stage than middle adulthood. But it is important to keep in mind that it is the stage when that tends to begin to occur. It's caused, or largely caused, by a decrease in estrogen production. And in a moment, as we begin to talk about menopause, and one of the characteristics of menopause is a reduction in estrogen, and that's why we begin to see, particularly for females, this decline occurring during middle adulthood. So again, looking at kind of an overview of some of the basic kinds of physical changes that occur at this point. I want to talk a little bit about, and again, it's under the category of physical development, a common experience, and when we think of middle adulthood, we tend to think of this experience in terms of impacting females, and that's menopause. Again, a lot of people hear the term, know the term, but I'm not sure how many actually know what menopause is. I'll put the definition up in a moment, but what is menopause? Anyone actually know what menopause is? Or what the result of menopause is? I'm sure someone does. Yeah. It's the stopping of not administrating and ovulation. And it marks the end of the ability to reproduce. Average age is somewhere around 50, 51. Anyone know of anyone? It's not uncommon sometimes for students to have parents who have gone through this experience. Anyone have a parent or know someone who's gone through it? And what do you remember, if anything, about that experience in terms of their experience of it?
Still has hot flashes, and it's been years, 5 years.
5 years since.
And she was horrible to be around.
Okay.
It wasn't just affecting her, it affected the whole house.
Exactly. I mean, one of the things that we find is, and I put it up here, again, one of the things is there's an experience, and we'll come back because there's another example here, experience a drop in production of estrogens. Two of the things that tend to be most characteristic of women going through menopause are the mood swings, and you kind of characterize that in terms of a lot of times as women are going through that transition in their lives are challenging at best to be around, can make things rather tense, and also the hot flashes tend to be very, very common as well. My wife has gone through, and I guess you said it pretty well, you said that was kind of really 5 years ago, in some ways still going through it. I mean, the periods have stopped and ovulation is ended, but my wife has done or is doing the hormone treatments, and so she has the patch. And we joke a lot because it's kind of funny because she is typically cold all the time. In the summer, her feet are cold. But it's interesting that when she's going through the periods of the hot flashes, it kind of creates confusion for me because I'm never sure exactly what's going on. Because a lot of times she's cold, but then when she has the hot flashes, then she's hot, and then begins to kind of sweat, and then once the hot flashes kind of pass, then we're back to being cold. So I never know exactly what the temperature is going to be. But it is interesting, and we joke a lot about it, and she does really well with all of it, but you can tell when the patch is starting to wear off. Moods begin to shift and change, and then the hot flashes start back up. And I'll just joke and say I think it's about time to change the patch. And that does, in her case, tend to regulate it pretty well. You were going to mention pretty much just the hot flashes, mood swings. Was it pretty extreme mood swings? Your aunt? So you were very much aware of her going through those changes. And again, it's interesting because it's not something that you can just readily control. It's something they kind of go through. And again, if they tend to be fairly emotional anyway, that tends to only intensify it. And I think it's hard to go through when you kind of know you're going through some of those changes and transitions. And at the same time, it's funny because almost anything will cause that roller coaster of emotions. I mean, you say something and all of a sudden someone's crying or yelling or screaming or any kind of range of emotions, sometimes. Anyone else know of anyone or experience anyone going through menopause? Again, I do think those tend to be fairly common characteristics and experiences. Reproductive organs shrink in size as a result, and it often takes longer for women to become aroused and to lubricate during sexual activity. Again, not a serious problem. It's just something that couples need to be aware of, and that after this, it may be necessary for women to make sure that they are experiencing adequate stimulation and arousal, particularly before sexual intercourse occurs, or it can be very uncomfortable. Also, it may be after prolonged sexual intercourse and penetration. It's not uncommon, again, for women to become dry after a certain period of time. So again, there are some physical changes. And again, these are not overly problematic. They're not drastic kinds of changes. But again, as I said, it's something that's important for couples to be aware of. Surprising when we talk about menopause, and we tend to kind of characterize it as a we kind of joke a lot about the dramatic mood swings, and they are there, and that some people will talk about that very difficult to live with during those changes. But what we actually find is the vast majority of women do not experience major distress. Again, it doesn't mean that they aren't going through the transitions and the changes and the mood swings, the hot flashes, but in terms of that being overly distressful, doesn't tend to be for the majority of women. In fact, for a lot of women, and this is what I have found to be the case in terms of conversations, is that what tends to be more distressing for women is just simply the anticipation of menopause and what menopause represents. Clearly a change in their lives, the ending of the ability to reproduce, another kind of sign that I am getting older. And again, like I said, a lot of it is simply that anticipation more than the actual experience itself. And in fact, for many women, and it clearly was the case of my wife, apart from, again, dealing with the mood changes and the initial transition and the hot flashes, and then, like I said, once the hormone treatments had begun, actually begin to level that out a lot, in many ways is actually, there are positives to the menopausal experience. Can anybody think of a positive? Yeah, the end of menstruation. For my wife, from the prior to us getting married and me knowing her, but particularly during our entire marriage up until menopause, she had very, very difficult periods, very, very painful, a lot of cramping, and for her, that marked the end of that experience every month, and that was a great relief. Can you think of another one? A kind of a positive for couples in many cases. Don't have to worry about birth control anymore. And so in many cases can, again, depend upon the type of birth control that a couple might be using, can actually create the opportunities for a lot more spontaneity, not being concerned, worried about that. And so again, there does tend to be some positives, with that. So again, really actually it's not distressing for the vast majority, and many women will do hormone treatments, will kind of balance out the changing hormone levels and make that transition not all that difficult. Not to say that there aren't a transition in there that can be somewhat difficult for a period of time. What we find on the part of men, there are some textbooks that talk about male menopause, and there really isn't a similar male experience that's like that of women. There are some changes that are taking place during middle adulthood. I'll put this one up because it's somewhat related to that. But the ability to reproduce is only diminished slightly. There is a decrease in the quantity of semen and sperm. But for the most part, men are not overly aware of that. Men are still actually capable of fertilizing an egg well up into adulthood. So there's not that same kind of experience for men as there is for women. And again, there are some changes. They clearly are not dramatic, and there's not a marked event, as in the ending of menstruation and the ending of ovulation as there is on the part of females. And again, the changes do tend to continue to be gradual. There is a gradual decline in testosterone, but has little effect on men who remain sexually active. And again, it's not something that men are going to be overly aware of. Their sexual interest still tends to be relatively high, clearly not at the peak. And we know that men's tend to peak sexually, late teens, early 20s. But again, the interest level remains, relatively high through much of adulthood, and particularly for those males who again remain sexually active.
What effect is there with the decline in testosterone if they don't remain sexually active, or they aren't ever sexually active?
Well, one, if they're not overly sexually active, probably the other changes are going to be less awareness of those. We'll put these other two up, and I think what it'll do is it'll kind of emphasize that. What we find is, generally speaking, over time it takes longer for men to obtain and maintain an erection. And again, I think what we find is for men who are sexually active, that decline is going to be less. And again, that decline may be more apparent, and it may be more unsettling for men who are less sexually active, because again, it may trigger, and I don't want to use the term panic, but over concern about that change. Again, like I said, for men who tend to remain more sexually active, I think there is an awareness of that, but again, there's also the awareness that is a gradual decline, not something that's going to impact their ability to perform, sexually. And again, for men who remain sexually active, for men who are less sexually active, it may again take longer. For men who are sexually active, again, the interest level may wane some, but still capable of being sexually active even more than once in a given day. Men who tend to be less sexually active, maybe a longer period of time in between experiences. But again, if they're not, then there's not overly concern or maybe even awareness of that. What we also find is that orgasms take longer, or it takes longer for men to reach an orgasm, are less forceful, and recovery time takes longer. And again, here I think is where we will see some of those slight changes in that, again, men who again remain fairly sexually active, again, that recovery time is going to take longer, but again, when a male was a teenager, that recovery time may be a matter of minutes. For men during middle adult, that may be, in terms of not only, say, the ability to have an erection and to be stimulated to orgasm, the interest level could be matters of hours, rather than minutes. And again, for men who are less sexually active, the interest in being sexually active again may be 24 hours or even longer in some cases. So again, there's a lot of variability in there. So again, I think for men even throughout middle adulthood, again, a lot of it has to do with levels of activity and just an awareness that there are some changes, but it's not something to be overly concerned about, though I think for some men it does create a lot of anxiety, with that. There's actually, again, along with the changes that women are going through, can you think of any reasons why, and again, for some men, these changes may be somewhat disturbing in terms of creating some anxiety or worry, but actually they could have some benefits on a couple's relationship. Can anybody think of what the benefit would be for some of the changes, particularly on the part of men? Any thoughts about how some of these changes actually could benefit the couple relationship? And again, as we mentioned, a question about sex, that tends to dwindle the discussion or comments. If we look at sexual response cycle, and I know most of you are aware of it, maybe hesitant to say anything out loud, we know that men tend to be, typically speaking, they tend to be aroused faster. They tend to move through the sexual response cycle much faster. And so as a result of this change, it will slow, literally, that process down. And so there's actually a greater chance. And one of the things that does happen often during middle adulthood is it could increase, particularly on the part of the female, greater sexual satisfaction. They may actually be more in sync or in line with each other in terms of the pace moving through that sexual response cycle. Now, again, take into consideration that for some women, particularly after menopause, again, it may take a little bit longer, again, for their own stimulation, but both may move actually through that process more together than at different paces, which tend to be more characteristic when they were younger. So again, there are changes that both experience. The changes for males are not the same as it is for females. Looking at cognitive development, moving away from physical development for a second. Again, if you'll remember when we were talking about young adulthood, we did tend to talk a little bit about it, and in your reading you'll see even more about post-formal thought, and that there were still some changes that were taking place during the young adult stage. And what we find is that thought processes, not that they aren't still kind of in an evolutionary process, but for the most part, middle-aged adults kind of are in their prime. There are not a lot of drastic changes in terms of the evolution of thought processes and how adults tend to look at and see the world. There's not near the changes in attitudes and values. Perceptions are pretty well kind of established by the time we hit middle adulthood. And a lot of that is the result of the experiences of life. And so what we find is we think about probably the most important parts of thought processes or cognitive development. We think about the ability to reason, the ability to problem solve, the use of creativity in the context of being able to come up with options and possibilities and addressing decision-making, problem-solving. Those are fairly well established by middle adulthood, and which is part of the reason why we find that problem-solving tends to reach its highest level of skills. And again, a lot of that is the result of the experiences of life. We still find, and again, this is nothing more than what we said earlier with young adulthood, we still find fluid intelligence continues to show slight declines. And again, fluid intelligence, if you remember, is simply talking about the processing of information, particularly in terms of the speed of which maybe information is processed. And again, a lot of that has to do, again, we've talked a lot about physical activity. A lot of it has to do with the types of mental activity that adults are involved in. And again, if adults are involved in activities, whether those are related to their work or related to the hobbies that they might have, the extent of decline is going to vary greatly. Can you think of an example, either work or in terms of social hobby kinds of activities that would keep mental processing at a fairly high pace or a fairly high speed? And again, it depends upon what activities that you're involved in. Excellent. If you're particularly in a job where, again, keeping up with changing technology is almost occurring on a regular basis, that's going to have an impact. What else might impact keeping processing speeds relatively high? Yeah. Again, we kind of almost hesitate to say that, but yeah, involved in mental activities in terms of something like crossword puzzles, or if the nature of our work requires us to remember lots of information or lots of facts, and some jobs require more focus on detail than other jobs, and in those cases, those mental capacities are going to show even less declines. Crystallized intelligence continues to increase, and we mentioned that at young adulthood, and will continue right on through later adulthood in terms of our ability to gain new knowledge. Again, how we take in that information, how we process that may show some shifts in changes. But overall, our ability to gain new knowledge continues to increase. A couple of areas, again, somewhat related to fluid intelligence. We do see some changes in terms of attention. In other words, how much information that can be taken in at once. And so what we find is some middle-aged adults tend to find it harder to multitask. In other words, to focus energy in more than one direction at one time. Now, some of that may be somewhat gender-related. Females tend to be better at multitasking than males in general. I clearly have found this to be the case in my own life, kind of as I move through middle adulthood. I tend to do better focusing on a particular task at one time. If I get too much information kind of coming at me at one time, I tend to have more difficulty kind of sorting it out and keeping track of it. And I found that I've had to use a lot of other means to help organize information that was not the case when I was younger. And it's, again, kind of reflecting back and kind of getting in touch with some of that. It seems like when I was younger, I could retain a whole lot more information and keep track of a lot more facts in a lot more different areas. And again, whether how much of that's aging, how much of that is the use of mental skills, it's hard to know. But clearly, I have seen some of these changes, as well. Likewise, we see a decline in short-term memory. And again, this may be due to the lack of or the use of memory strategies. Again, you're currently in situations where you're required as a result of doing academic work, and as you're constantly having to do exams and tests, you're forced to continue to use those memory strategies, continue to be involved in activities that require you to memorize a great deal of information or to keep a great deal of information in your minds. And then one of the things as you move out of this environment, this stage of your life, that tends to be less of a need to retain or kind of hold that amount of information, which is also probably partly true why often after taking an exam and shortly after, a good bit of that information tends to be lost and displaced someplace else. Again, if you're not in situations that require you to use that information on an ongoing, readily basis. And so, again, memory tends to be short-term. Again, I have found this to be so true in my life in terms of the decline. My family and I joke about it, and I mention it constantly, and students that I'm around pretty consistently hear me say it pretty frequently. I do have difficulty remembering things over a very long period of time. That's why I'm always encouraging students, write it down, send me an email message or something so that I have it written. Because again, I will in less than 24 hours. If you tell me something today, if I don't write it down, if I don't have it someplace, I won't remember it 24 hours from now, much less next week, or next month. And students will say, well, I just want to let you know, which is wonderful, and I'm glad students do. I'm going to be gone next month. That's helpful. The problem is next month when you come back and you do remember that I told you I was going to be gone. I remember vaguely mentioning something. But again, if I've not written it down, and that's why I keep everything in writing. I keep it down. I make list after list after list because what I used to be able to automatically remember, I don't. And so I have found myself, which I didn't used to do at all when I was younger, making lists. Kind of keep me focused on the things that I've got to do, not only today, but in the immediate future as well. But again, I think for middle-aged adults, again, they still overall are in their prime. Again, particularly in terms of the ability to process information, in terms of utilizing information, utilizing knowledge, clearly at a place where they tend, based on life experiences, to make better decisions, to do better at problem solving than they did when they were younger. All right. Again, as we transition and as we begin to start to take a look at some aspects of social development, again, looking at just some of the high points. Again, social development simply focusing on relationships. Again, I think sometimes middle adulthood is very much like middle childhood in many respects. We clearly come out of adolescence, young adulthood, where there apparently seems to be a lot of dramatic changes, drastic, events, significant events that are occurring. We tend to focus a good bit of energy on the later years when we see more apparent changes, more drastic changes in comparison, to the previous stage. And so a lot of the changes, as we've already indicated, during middle adulthood tend to be more gradual. They tend to be things that are not just overly noticeable during this roughly 25-year period of time. And so a lot of times we tend to think that there's not a lot going on, or that there's not as much going on significantly as the earlier adult stages as well as the later adult stages. And again, very characteristic of what we saw during childhood. But I would suggest that the changes are significant and that they are meaningful. And again, they are the continuation and setting the platform for what's going to occur, again, in the next stage of life. In terms of social development, it is a time of changing relationships. Again, we often maybe aren't aware of it. We don't think about it until we begin to look at that in context. And with any change, we have been talking about changes throughout this semester, is that change requires adjustment. And clearly, as we look at changes that are taking place in terms of relationships, there is a reevaluation of what's going on, what those changes mean, and there is, a process of adjusting to those. There are existing relationships that do tend, in most cases, to be strengthened, and we'll look at those and we'll talk about some of those. There is also a time for forming new relationships and new roles. And again, a lot of times we tend to almost minimize some of those new roles. Some of them we hardly ever even mention or talk about. But we are going to do that in our discussion. So again, existing roles, we want to look at how some of those are evolving and changing. And then likewise, what we want to do is take a look at what some of the new roles, relationships are that are evolving. We want to look at it in kind of three forms. We want to look at, again, probably the most significant relationships that do occur. Look at the marital relationship. We want to look at relationships with the evolution of relationships, between middle-aged adults and their now adult children in most cases, not all cases. And then also look at their relationship with parents who are now getting older, and in most cases, if have not, are soon evolving in and moving into later adulthood. We also want to take a look at new roles that will take place as a result of their adult children getting older and moving through marriage, their transition into parenthood, and what roles that creates for those adults. And then we also want to take a look at, very briefly, changes that take place in terms of friendships that really are significant during middle adulthood, and then also some changes that take place in terms of sibling relationships. And so, again, when we begin to look at that, we begin to realize there are a lot of changes that are occurring. They may not be overly dramatic, but I think they are clearly significant. Looking at marital relationships, and again, clearly don't want to make the assumption at all is that all middle-aged adults are in a marital relationship or in a committed relationship even. But again, the vast majority are. Again, one of the things that we said when we were talking about young adulthood is we know that the majority of Americans, at least, will marry at some point in time in their lives. Again, a high percentage, as we've already said, will divorce, but many of them, again, will remarry. And so many will move into middle adulthood in marital relationships. And so the vast majority, 9 out of 10 middle-aged adults, live in families. And in most of those, that is with a spouse. Again, clearly, and we all know some middle-aged adults that do live alone, may have significant relationships, but still tend to live and reside alone. But the majority, again, and so it's hard to talk about middle adulthood without talking about without marital relationships, because the majority do find themselves in that situation. Marriages are generally fairly stable during middle adulthood. Only about 10% of marriages end after 20 years. Again, we know that there are some that do. There are probably more that do in this generation that did in the previous generation of middle-aged adults, and so that probably has increased when you compare one generation to the next. But we find that the vast majority of divorces are going to occur within the first 10 years of marriage. And after that, the longer a couple's married, the less likely are that they are going to divorce. So again, they do tend to be fairly stable. Again, we talked about marital satisfaction. We talked about marital stability when we were doing young adulthood. We do find marital satisfaction is a strong predictor of marital stability. In other words, if couples are able to move through the transitions in their lives, and as they move into the transitions that take place during middle adulthood, and if they're able to maintain a high level of marital satisfaction, they are more than likely going to stay together. And that's that marital stability. I think what's also important that the research pretty consistently shows us that, again, strong, healthy marriages does contribute to personal well-being, personal satisfaction, personal health, that there is a relationship between those. And we know that well-being, personal satisfaction is diminished for those that have experienced divorce in many cases, and who then begin to go through this stage as single adults. Again, not necessarily in a way that is overly problematic for them, but there does tend to be a decline in comparison to those that continue to be married, but more importantly, those that continue to be married and to be in satisfying, happy relationships. What we find is that marital satisfaction seems to follow a U-shaped curve. We often talk about the U-shaped curve in terms of being a reversed curvilinear relationship in some sense. Again, if you think of a U, if you look at the top of the U, we see that's high satisfaction. And then what we see as we move down in the drop of the U, we see a decline. And then at some point in time, we begin to see satisfaction begin to go up. Now, the top of the U would, in terms of high satisfaction, would mark what stage in a couple's relationship? Beginning. We often refer to it as newlyweds, the honeymoon stage. It tends to be the time in most couples' lives that marital satisfaction is at its very peak. Now, again, keep in mind there are a lot of factors, a lot of circumstances that will determine the extent or the shape of that U. But again, if we look at a lot of the literature, we do tend to see that pattern exist. Again, and I think it's important to keep in mind, it doesn't always have to be that way, but it is. And again, I think for some, it can be a very narrow kind of drop or shift. Now, you already know the answer to this. When will we begin to see marital satisfaction start to decline generally? Once we begin, and we already talked about when we make that transition to having children. And again, a lot of it has to do with what couples do in terms of making that transition that we've already talked about and the extent to which they stay focused on the couple relationship. But often what happens, and somewhat naturally, as the energy focuses to the newborn, this child, a lot of times energy focuses away from the marital relationship. And there tends to be some decline, some drop in marital satisfaction. Again, for couples who are really intentional, stay real focused on their marriage, in addition to focusing on their new role as parents, that decline can be very, very marginal. Now, when would you guess that marital satisfaction tends to reach its lowest point? Any guesses? See it highest during the newlywed or honeymoon phase, starts to decline with the transition. Any thoughts about when it's going to reach its lowest point? When kids are in their adolescence, that's exactly right. For a variety of reasons. Some of that, again, dependent upon, we do know that there tends to be that kind of increase in conflict. There is that adjustment to kids who are making that last final kind of push for independence, and a lot of energy tends to get focused on, and not necessarily, even negatively necessarily, but I think, again, if you begin to think about it, even though, once the kids started elementary school and there was an interest in school, but what tends to happen as kids begin to move into junior high and high school in terms of school? I know this is just starting to happen for us. What tends to happen in terms of focus and activity levels. Yeah, at least for part of the adolescence. And what I find as parents is that you spend a lot more time around school activities that are taking place, particularly activities that your child might be involved in differently than elementary school. I mean, we're seeing it, right now just in terms of if you have a child that's involved in any of the extracurricular activities, such as sporting events. They don't tend to be as present in elementary school. You've got the open houses, you've got the teacher conferences, you have those kinds of things, and now all of a sudden you have a variety of school activities. You got the sporting events, you got the school plays, you have a lot of other things that are happening. So there tends to be a lot of focus around activities that are going on and around the adolescent's lives, even though the adolescent may be spending a lot more time with peers and in their curricular activities, parents still tend to be involved in a kind of stand back kind of role, but still consumes a lot of their time and energy. And then there is the increased conflict that does occur that can take a lot of emotional energy in some cases. So satisfaction does tend to kind of begin to decline and reach its bottom point during that period of adolescence and probably early adolescence. And then when does marital satisfaction start to go back up? When they leave the house. One of the things we find is we begin to launch children. And again, a lot of it depends upon what couples do, with that. But as children begin, and even I think as adolescents begin to move into later adolescence, where they clearly are much more on their own, doing their own thing, and all of a sudden the couple has now the opportunity, if they choose to begin to really focus differently on their relationship. And then once kids are gone, once we've launched kids from the home, clearly what we find is it's now the couple. And the couple clearly has different time. And if they do focus it or refocus it back on their relationship, marital satisfaction will again begin to go back up. Now, when does it reach its highest point? Again. And it's not during middle adulthood. During retirement years. And again, depending upon how couples make that adjustment, but for a lot of couples, we'll talk more about this when we get to later adulthood, more and more couples will talk about reaching a level of satisfaction that's almost equal to the newlywed stage and sometimes even better. And we'll talk some about why that would be when we get to later adult stage. So again, tends to follow that U-shaped curve. Highest newlyweds, drops with that transition, bottoms out at adolescence, and then begins to go up as we begin to launch children, into their own now young adult world. Yes. No, it does not. Not at all. And again, I think it's a matter of what couples do, how they adjust. I think there are some couples, literally, where marital satisfaction doesn't show this drop U-shaped curve, but actually shows a situation of actually satisfaction going up. Where newlywed is a wonderful stage of life, but also it's a time of a lot of initial adjustment and transitions. And so if couples are successful in making that adjustment and transition and working through learning how to live with one another, and they do that successfully, relationships may actually get even better if they learn how to deal with conflict, learn to develop good communication skills. And again, I think for some couples, again, it may not tend to be the majority, that when children come along, doesn't necessarily have to mean a decline in the focus on the relationship. But I know for my wife and I, it clearly was a time of, there was a refocus, but we did it as a couple. And so as we focused to that transition of our child, we did that together. And so it was still a very fulfilling part of our lives personally, but as a couple, as we chose to co-parent together. Now, were there some shifts and changes? Well, yeah, there wasn't near as much time that we could spend together alone, particularly when the child was really young, but it was still stuff that we did together. And so I really want to believe that in many, many respects, satisfaction, now I'm not talking maybe steep, but I would really want to believe that satisfaction really was more and continues to be more on an increase than drops. We have not, and I think many couples can talk about that there was not this drastic shift. In fact, in reality, many couples' relationships may not really be a U-shaped as much as kind of going through maybe a period of time where, say, it plateaus and then it goes up, and then there be maybe brief momentary times of a drop, but they tend to be rather brief, and then picking it back up because they're real focused and realize, well, maybe we've momentarily kind of lost touch a little bit. And then they re-engage in the relationship, and then it starts to go back. And so you still tend to have a gradual decline, but you'll have little dips. Because I think in every relationship you go through periods of time that are more difficult, where you aren't as focused on the relationship, whether that's a result of children or work or personal issues. So no, they don't all follow that. I think what happens, again, when you do literature and you're looking at thousands and thousands, that you can begin to understand where there does tend to be somewhat of that typical pattern. But it's an excellent question, because I think what we tend to do sometimes is we look at those general patterns and then we assume that's the pattern for everyone. And that clearly is not the case, at all. Again, this is another one of those. It depends on the couple, depends on how couples make shifts and transitions. We do see that, again, if you look at the research, we do see that sexual activity does tend to diminish the longer a couple's married. That is the general pattern. For a lot of couples, again, that stay very focused and very intentional on their relationship, those changes may be very slightly and maybe, again, very, very gradual. And some of that simply may be, again, some of the physical changes that are going on. Again, what we've already talked about. The refractory period for men does increase, and so the interest level and the ability to, again, be aroused, the interest to be aroused, for more sexual activity, that does tend to shift. But again, it's not something that's overly drastic or dramatic, and so those slight changes may be, anywhere from maybe when they were younger may have been several times a week, may be reduced to 1 or 2 times less a week. So again, there is that decline, but the extent of that decline, and again, I think there's a lot of variability in there. I think a lot of it has to do with how couples adjust again to that transition to having children, and it doesn't mean that you quit. You have to quit having sexual relationships. It simply means you may need to be more creative. You may need to look for opportunities differently. You may need to look for ways to have more private time that you didn't have to do in the same way intentionally when there weren't children. But again, I think for many, many couples, those changes are very slight, and they don't have a tremendous impact over the relationship. Now, there's going to be the exception. There are other couples where those changes are much more drastic in terms of decline, and where couples do quit focusing on the relationship, and where that's one of the part of the relationships that becomes a less of an important part of their lives. So again, it's a lot of variability, in that. I think I missed one point. Let me kind of go back to it real quickly. Again, as we just talked about, the sexual part of the relationship, one of the things we do find is that the key factor for couples during this stage, and again, this is going to have a relationship, I think, to the sexual relationship as well, is the extent to which they maintain a high degree of emotional intimacy. And couples that maintain a high level of emotional intimacy also tend to continue more sexual relationships during this stage of life. And the best way to understand this, and when you talk to middle-aged adults, and somewhat characteristic of later adulthood as well, and you talk about what's most important about your marriage relationship right now, and most of them will talk about their partner being what? And I think it's what really captures this emotional intimacy. Best friend. They'll talk about those, this is the person I can talk to, this is the person I can confide in, this is the person I really enjoy being around. Hopefully by this time we've worked through much of the conflict, and there's not as much conflict. We've worked out, long time ago dealing with, the little habits and we've adjusted those kinds of things. And again, if they have developed a very solid, and hopefully it was there at the beginning of the relationship, but if they have maintained that good friendship into middle adulthood, then this is what keeps that relationship really strong and healthy, and that's what they'll talk about as being most important. And when that is really high, the sexual relationship tends to remain important as well. And what they'll often say is, well, I've come to realize that that's not the most important thing, but again, they often don't diminish its importance as well. Next time, we'll continue to look a little bit at marital relationships and talk about the transition that needs to take place as we talk about launching children into the adult world.